The Montana back roads were quiet that autumn morning, the golden light breaking through the towering pines as paramedic Sarah Mitchell and Mike Reynolds navigated their ambulance home after a grueling night shift. They were exhausted, ready for nothing but a hot meal and a few precious hours of sleep, but fate had other plans as they rounded a bend. Something stopped them in their tracks. A bobcat standing defiantly in the middle of the road. At first it seemed like just another wild encounter, but then the animal did something strange. It didn't flee, it didn't snarl. Instead, it let out a sound that sent chills down Sarah's spine. An urgent, almost pleading yowl. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the bobcat turned and vanished into the tree. Something about the moment felt deliberate, against every instinct, against all logic. Sarah knew one thing for certain: this wild animal wanted them to follow. What they discovered when they did would leave them shaken to their core and change the way they saw the wild forever. The October dawn painted Montana's Bitterroot Valley in shades of amber and rose, the kind of morning that made Sarah Mitchell question why anyone would choose to live in the city. Even after a grueling 12-hour night shift, she couldn't help but appreciate the way the sunrise caught the frost on the prairie grass, turning each blade into a prism of light. The ambulance's heater hummed, steadily fighting off the characteristic chill of a Montana autumn. I think this might be a record, Mike Reynolds said from behind the wheel, his voice rough with fatigue. 4 calls in one night, all of them over an hour's drive each way. He rubbed his eyes with one hand, keeping the other steady on the steering wheel. At 45, Mike had been working as a paramedic in Raleigh County for nearly 2 decades, but the long rural routes still took their toll. Sarah nodded, suppressing a yawn. At 28, she was the newest member of the county's emergency response team, but her local roots ran deep. 5 generations of her family had called this valley home, and she knew every dirt road and hunting trail like the back of her hand. It was that knowledge that had earned her a spot on the team despite her relative inexperience. At least they were all happy ending, she replied, thinking about their last call. A rancher with chest pain that turned out to be severe in digestion, though I could have done without Mr. Peterson's detailed description of his wife's meatloaf. Mike chuckled, the sound war and familiar. After 2 years of partnership, that man could talk the years off. He stopped mid-sentence, foot easing onto the brake as they rounded a bend in the road. There, in the middle of the gravel road, stood a bobcat. Sarah felt her breath catch in. All her years living in Montana, she'd only caught glimpses of the elusive creatures, a flash of spotted fur disappearing into the underbrush, the suggestion of movement in the trees. But this one stood its ground, staring directly at their approaching vehicle with unnerving intensity. The cat was beautiful in the way that all wild things are beautiful, raw and dangerous and perfect. Its tufted ears were alert, its muscular body tins beneath its tawny, spotted coat, but something about its posture seemed wrong to Sarah's trained. That's strange, Mike muttered, slowing the ambulance to a crawl. They usually run at the first sign of people. The bobcat took several deliberate steps toward them, then stopped, turning to look back at the dense line of ponderosa pines that bordered the road. A sound emerged from its throat, not the snarl Sarah would have expected, but a low, keening yowl that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Mike, she said, slowly, her eyes fixed on the animal. I think it wants us to follow it. He shot her an incredulous look. You've been watching too many Lassie reruns, Sarah. It's a wild animal, not a tour guide. But the bobcat yelled again, taking a few more steps toward the tree line before turning back to look at them. There was something in its eyes that Sarah couldn't ignore, a desperate intelligence that seemed to transcend the natural barrier between human and wild. Look at how it's acting, she insisted, already unbuckling her seat belt. This isn't normal behavior for a bobcat. Something's wrong, Sarah. Wait, Mike started, but she was already opening the door. He cursed under his breath, grabbing the radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 7 we're stopped on. Old Creek Road about 5 m east of the Thompson property. We've encountered a situation with local wildlife standing by the static-filled acknowledgement. Barely registered as Sarah stepped carefully onto the gravel road. The morning air bit at her exposed skin, but she barely noticed her attention was focused entirely on the Bobcat, which was now pacing anxiously between them and the trees. She took a tentative step forward. The Bobcat didn't bare its teeth or flatten its ears, classic signs of aggression she learned about in the mandatory wildlife safety courses. Instead, it made that same plaintive sound and moved further toward the trees. "This is crazy," Mike muttered, coming up beside her with their trauma kit. "If we get mauled by a Bobcat, I'm never letting you live it down," noted Sarah replied, not taking her eyes off their unusual guide. They followed at a careful distance, their boots crunching on fallen pine needles as they entered the forest. The morning light filtered through the canopy above, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. The Bobcat led them about 50 yards into the woods, following what appeared to be a game trail. Then it stopped, turning toward a massive ponderosa pine. Sarah's heart dropped as she saw what lay at its base. A young Bobcat, no more than a few months old, lay curled on its side. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, and even from several feet away, Sarah could see the cause of its distress. An illegal snare trap had caught the cub's back leg, the metal wire cutting deep into the flesh. "Oh God," she breathed, anger and compassion wearing in her chest. Snare traps had been banned in this part of Montana for years, precisely because of situations like this. They were indiscriminate killers, catching anything unfortunate enough to step into them. The mother Bobcat, for Sarah, was now certain that's what she was moved to stand near her cub, making soft chirping sounds that broke Sarah's heart. The young cat's only response was a weak twitch of its ear. Mike was already on the radio calling for wildlife services, but Sarah knew time was critical. The cub's leg was badly swollen, and she could see signs of infection setting in around the wound. If they waited for official help to arrive, it might be too late. "We have to help it now," she said, reaching for the trauma shears in there. Kit might grab her arm. "Sarah, think about this. That's a wild animal, and its mother is right there. We should wait for the professionals." She met his concern gaze. "Mike, look at that leg. That cub doesn't have time to wait. The mother us here. She's asking for help in the only way she knows how." As if to confirm Sarah's words, the mother Bobcat sat down, her eyes fixed on them with an almost supernatural intensity. There was no aggression in her posture, only a weary desperation that Sarah recognized from countless human parents she dealt with in similar situations. Mike released her arm with a sigh. "I'll get the antibiotics and bandages ready, but please be careful." Sarah approached slowly, keeping her movements smooth and deliberate. The mother Bobcat time but didn't move from her spot. When Sarah was within a few feet of the cub, she knelt down, speaking in the same soft, steady voice she used with frightened children. "It's okay," she murmured, though she knew the animals couldn't understand her. "Words are going to help your baby." The cub was in worse shape. Up close, the snare had cut deep into the muscle of its back leg, and the wound was angry and inflamed. But when Sarah gently touched its side, she could feel the strong, rapid beat of its heart. It was a fighter. With careful precision, she positioned the trauma shears around the wire of the snare. The metal was thick, designed to hold much larger prey, but the medical grade shears were sharp. It took all her strength, but the wire finally gave way. With a sharp snap, the cub flinched but didn't struggle as she carefully unwound the remaining wire from its leg. Mike handed her antiseptic wipes, and she cleaned the wound as best she could, trying to ignore the way the mother Bobcat's muscles coiled with tension at every sound of pain from her cub. The bleedings mostly stopped, Mike observed, helping her wrap the leg in sterile gauze. But that infection needs proper treatment. As if on cue, they heard the rumble of an approaching vehicle a few Minutes later, Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the Montana Wildlife Center pushed through the underbrush, followed by two of her staff members she took in the scene with practice deficiency well. This is a first, she said, kneeling beside Sarah to examine their handiwork when dispatch said a Bobcat had flagged down an ambulance. I thought someone was pulling my leg. She pulled out a tranquilizer gun, but to everyone's surprise, the mother Bobcat backed away on her own, giving them space to work. She retreated to the edge of the clearing, but kept her eyes fixed on her cub as Dr. Rodriguez administered the sedative. The leg can be saved, the wildlife veterinarian announced after a thorough examination, but she'll need surgery and several weeks of rehabilitation. She looked up at the mother Bobcat, who hadn't moved from her vigilant position. The hard part will be keeping Mama here from trying to break into our facility. Will you release the in the same area? Sarah asked as they carefully transferred the sedated cub to a transport carrier. Dr. Rodriguez nodded. Once the cub is healed, we'll release them both right here. Bobcats are territorial, and this is clearly their home range. She paused, looking thoughtful. You know, in 20 years of wildlife medicine, I've never seen anything quite like this. That mother somehow knew to seek human help, and she chose exactly the right humans, medical professionals, with the tools and knowledge to help. Sarah watched as the mother Bobcat followed them at a distance as they carried her cub back to the road. The wildcat's behavior defied everything she'd been taught about wildlife, but perhaps there were some things that transcended the boundaries between species, like a mother's love for her child. 3 months later, on a crisp January morning, Sarah and Mike stood at the edge of the same clearing. Dr. Rodriguez was removing the carrier door, and a much healthier young Bobcat bounded out, its formerly injured leg showing no sign of weakness. The cub immediately ran to where its mother waited in the shadows of the pines. The reunion was brief but beautiful, a quick touch of noses, a soft chirp, and then both cats melted into the forest as if they'd never been anywhere else. But just before they disappeared completely, the mother Bobcat paused, turning to look back at the humans who had saved her child. For a moment, their eyes met, and Sarah felt something pass between them, an understanding perhaps, or an acknowledgement of the trust that had been given and honored. Then the Bobcat was gone, leaving only tracks in the snow and an indelible memory in the hearts of those who had witnessed this remarkable intersection of wild and human worlds. The story made the local papers. Of course, Bobcat leads ambulance to injured cub ran the headline in the Raleigh Republic. Sarah kept a copy pinned to the bulletin board at the station next to the thank you cards from grateful patients and their families. But the real impact of that October morning went deeper than newspaper headlines. It changed the way Sarah saw her role as a paramedic. She'd always known her job was about more than just medical procedures and protocols. It was about trust between patient and caregiver, between partners, between the community and those who serve it. Now she understood that trust could extend beyond the human world into the wild places where instinct and intelligence sometimes blurred into something like wisdom. The incident also led to increased enforcement of anti-poaching laws in the area. Local conservation officers found and removed 6 more illegal snares in the following weeks, and the county implemented steeper penalties for those caught setting them. Sometimes it took a remarkable story to remind people why such laws existed in the first place. Mike never quite got over the surreal nature of their wildlife rescue. I still can't believe you got me to follow a Bobcat into the woods, he would say, shaking his head. But Sarah noticed that he drove a little more slowly on their early morning returns to the station, his eyes scanning the roadside with new awareness. As for Sarah, she often thought about that mother Bobcat in the years that followed on particularly difficult calls when everything seemed to be going wrong. She would remember those intense yellow eyes and the desperate courage it must have taken to approach humans for Help it reminded her that sometimes the best thing you could do was trust your instincts and take a chance on kindness. She also gained a reputation among her colleagues for having a particular touch with animal-related emergencies when a horse was trapped in a cattle guard or a dog was injured on a hiking trail. Sarah was the one they called. She couldn't explain how, but something about that morning with the Bobcats had given her a new understanding of the connection between all living things. 1 year too. The day after the rescue, Sarah was driving home from a shift when she spotted movement in her headlights. Two Bobcats, one large, one smaller, crossed the road ahead of her. They paused briefly in the beam of her lights, and though she couldn't be sure they were the same one, she liked to think they were. The larger cat seemed to nod in her direction before they vanished into the night. That evening, sitting on her porch with a cup of coffee, Sarah reflected on how a single act of trust could ripple outward, touching lives, both human and wild. The mother Bobcat had taken a desperate chance that morning, going against every natural instinct to seek help from what should have been enemies. In doing so, she had not only saved her cub, but had also reminded everyone involved of the extraordinary connections possible between all living creatures. The story became something of a legend in Ravli County, passed around at dinner tables and campfires. Some embellished it, claiming the mother Bobcat had actually jumped into the ambulance, or that she'd shown up at the wildlife center every day during her cub's recovery. Sarah always told it exactly as it had happened, because the truth was remarkable enough. It was a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary moments came not from grand gestures or elaborate plans, but from simple acts of trust and compassion. A desperate mother, two tired paramedics, and a moment of understanding that bridged the gap between wild and tame. These were the elements of a story that would be remembered long after the newspaper clippings had yellowed and faded. Years later, when Sarah trained new paramedics, she always made sure to tell them that their job wasn't just about following protocols and performing procedures. It was about being ready for the unexpected, about recognizing when to break from routine and trust their instincts. Sometimes, she would say, help comes from unexpected places, and healing happens in unexpected ways. And on quiet mornings when the sun painted the valley in shades of gold and pink, she would sometimes catch a glimpse of a spotted coat in the distance, or hear a familiar yowl in the forest. Whether it was the same Bobcat family or others, it didn't really matter. What mattered was the reminder that in this wild and beautiful world, compassion knew no boundaries, and trust, once given and honored, could bridge any divide. The mother Bobcat's desperate gamble that October morning had done more than save her cub. It had reminded everyone involved of the extraordinary connections possible between all living creatures, and the remarkable things that could happen when fear gave way to trust and understanding. It was a lesson Sarah carried with her every day, as valuable as any medical training or emergency protocol. And somewhere in the forest of the Bitterroot Valley, a mother Bobcat and her grown cub continued their wild lives, perhaps remembering the morning when they had trusted their lives to human hands and found that trust rewarded with healing and freedom.